Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. It's been a while. My apologies for not posting anything for the past couple of weeks. My only excuse is that I had a bit of a house crisis. My very, very old boiler decided to finally kick the bucket during a week that was exceptionally cold in Washington, D.C. It was no surprise, in a way, that it started having troubles. We moved into this house more than 25 years ago, and when we bought it, the house inspector warned us that we would probably have to replace the boiler system within a couple of years, given that it was already at least 20-something years old. Well, it certainly lasted a lot longer than a couple of years, but it is no more. Although the technicians were hopeful that there might be a quick fix, it turned out that the boiler had to be replaced with a fancy new one, which controls both the heat and the hot water. Then, in the process of installation, they realized that there was a very small leak in one of the 100-year-old water pipes that brings municipal water inside our house. I had to call a plumber to fix that, and while it was a fairly small fix, he warned me that I might need to make a much larger replacement fairly soon. All in all, this housework cost only slightly less than a small car. My very cold house and the constant influx of workers were enough to keep me from filming. Instead, I put on multiple layers of hand knits and cuddled up under an electric blanket, and I read. I read a lot, which I needed to do because I've committed myself to a fair bit of reading that I can't really talk about on this channel. I have the great pleasure of being a judge for a literary prize. Not the Bookerer or anything like that, but it's still a job that comes with a fair bit of a time commitment. Expensive house fixes are always stressful, aren't they? And this time I faced the first really enormous decision I've had to make since my spouse David died 7 months ago now. I have friends who have been through similar heating problems, and it's been terrific to have people willing to support me in any ways I needed, including offering me warm places to hang out or sleep whenever I wanted. Still, any little crisis makes me miss David even more. And perhaps especially any time the house is cold. Whenever I got chilly at night, I used to just nudge a little closer to him, maybe stretching out my feet a little closer to what I thought of as my own personal bed warmer. Now, when I stretch my toes out towards his side of the bed, when I'm cold and half asleep, I just feel the even colder sheets. Well, as weird as it was to try to deal with all this house maintenance without David, there was also some really good news in my family, and I wanted to tell David all about it. I mentioned to one of my friends, a friend I made here on Booktube actually, that sometimes I have these moments where it feels like he's just away for a few days, maybe at an out-of-town conference for work, and that I can give him a call, or even that he'll walk in the door in just a few hours. Our minds do play tricks on us. And all of these moments of that awful combination of deep love and deep sadness made me absolutely love one of the books I read this month, Julian, a book I first heard about when the wonderful Booktubers and Novella and Bob the Bookerer interviewed the author, Fleur Pierets. Her powerful memoir is an account of her too brief relationship with her partner and wife, Julian, including their work and their activism together, the experience of going through Julian's illness, and the way grief affected Pierets as she tried to build a life without the person she loved by her side. I very much encourage you to go watch Anne and Bob's interview with Fleur Pierets, an author from Belgium whose book was published a few years ago in Flemish and translated very recently into English by Elizabeth Kahn. While this is very much a book about illness and dying and grief, it's also very much a book about love, and not just the love that was within their own relationship. Fleur and Julian decided to engage in what they called positive activism by highlighting the growing movement to legalize not only queer identity and relationships, but also same-sex marriage. In 2017, they planned to get married in every country that had legalized same-sex marriage. 22 countries when they first conceived the project, and several more before they actually got started. Their project got a lot of attention in the press, partly because they were gifted journalists and artists with important pre-existing connections, and partly because these two women just glowed in the dark together. You can tell it on the pages of the book, and you can look up the photographs online and see it very clearly there too. But before they'd really gotten going on their project, Julian was diagnosed with breast cancer. Like me, she decided not to have reconstructive surgery following her mastectomy. And unlike me, her breast cancer turned out to be metastatic, meaning it spread throughout her body to her bones and brain and other locations. I say it was metastatic cancer, but technically the book doesn't exactly say that. In fact, I was especially eager to read this book because Julian had brain tumors. I had assumed incorrectly that she might have had glioblastoma, as David did. Hearing that she had breast cancer, and that it was probably the particular kind of cancer that caused the tumors in her brain and elsewhere, was not something I had expected. So I mentioned that Julian decided to forego breast reconstruction, a decision she made partly because of the kind of natural androgyny that she had long expressed. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but Pierets' discussion of gender in this book is a bit different from what I've seen in other recent books. Julian, like many feminist theorists from the past several decades, thought of gender as culturally constructed, that is, learned behaviors rather than something, quote, real, and that although she embraced an androgynous style in her daily life, she defined herself as female, as a woman. In fact, one sentence early on kind of stuck out at me. Pierets writes, "She was a woman, that much was certain." When I first read that sentence, it occurred to me that the translation might have put more weight somehow on that sentence than the author had intended. Then I thought, well, perhaps Pierets was being defensive because other people might be using the pronoun they for Julian, which was a pronoun she did not choose. But then, when we find out she's been diagnosed with breast cancer, the "that much was certain" line flooded back to me, and I realized that it was pointing to the metonymy or symbolism here. Yes, all people can get breast cancer, not just women, but breast cancer is a profoundly gendered disease, both in statistics and in cultural experience. I'm afraid I'm talking about this book in ways that might not be at all what a reader might take from it if they were coming to the book with less personally relevant backgrounds. But I'm going to mention one more part related to my personal experience. I think Pierets writes more openly about some of the specifics, the emotional impacts, as well as the physical realities of spending time with someone who is dying, someone you love deeply who is dying slowly at home, or at least with constant physical care you provide yourself. I've read a ridiculous number of books recently about illness and dying, and this book is more real than anything I have read before, even at the same moments when it was also more beautiful than anything I had read about caring for a dying person. Julian is going to be in my short stack of books I reread and reread again, and I'm exceptionally grateful to Anne and Bob for bringing it to my attention. I read another book that has a somewhat similar theme to Julian, actually. The book is called Sex with a Brain Injury, Concussion and Recovery, and it's written by Annie Liontas and published just a couple of weeks ago, I think. When the publisher offered to send me a copy for review, I picked it up partly because my son had experienced a series of concussions over the past year. The first was straightforward, not enough to make him black out or anything like that. And the preceding ones would not necessarily have had much impact, so to speak, on someone who had not had a concussion before. Nevertheless, even the mildest bumps could immediately bring back many of the symptoms of a more significant concussion. Even just traveling along a bumpy road could trigger his symptoms, or they could be triggered by what someone might think of as even a gentle pat on the head. As my son talked with me about his experiences and what he was learning from other people who'd had concussions and from his healthcare team as well, I got really fascinated. In this book, by a person whose first concussion was also relatively mild, but which was quickly followed by a couple of additional mild concussions, well, the book adds quite a bit to the insights I'd already learned from what my son had shared with me. I especially enjoyed Liontas' presentation of scientific, social, and even historical research into concussions and brain injury. I'd never spent much time thinking about how head trauma had played such a huge role in the lives of people like Harriet Tubman, active in the Underground Railroad during the antebellum period in the U.S., or Henry VIII. Really fascinating stuff. But this book is also very much a memoir. Like Pierets' book, Julian, Sex with a Brain Injury looks at queer sexuality and same-sex marriage. The sex in the title does, in one little section, mean exactly what the suggestive title might suggest, but mostly it's a nod to the gendered experience of concussion. That is, how concussions might be experienced a bit differently because of the biological and cultural experiences of gender. And the sex of the title is also, I think, a nod to the main theme that runs through the book, the impact that one person's concussion can have on a marriage, on a romantic relationship. There were times when I was turned off by the author's decision to include several different stories that contained information that Liontas wanted to keep private. The lines are explicitly blacked out. Occasionally, I thought the technique was an interesting, maybe postmodern attempt to blur the lines between what was visible and what was invisible, but overall, this choice usually felt too gimmicky to me. Let me read you one example. Me. What don't I know about you? You. A couple of blacked out lines. Me. One blacked out line. You. There's nothing you don't know about me that I want to tell you. Liontas is trying to balance telling us that she's trying to talk about something private, trying to be open in some way, but explicitly within what is an intimate discussion. And I think the effort to thread that needle is really hard. Still, I wasn't convinced that her effort was successful. I'll recommend this book, especially to readers who've appreciated other books about disability and chronic illness, like Megan O'Rourke's fairly well-done investigative memoir, The Invisible Kingdom. So both Julian and Sex with a Brain Injury are memoirs. The last two books I want to talk about today have as a subtitle, a novel. In general, I find that labeling a little weird, but in both these cases, the novels seem very much like memoirs, not because they track the real lives of the authors, which I suppose they might, but I have no idea, but because they are both told in first person by narrators recounting their lives in ways that feel very real, no matter how fictional they were. The first is BAUMGARTNER, a novel by Paul Auster. I've never read an Auster novel before, although he's written quite a number of well-respected books, and I've only poked through his recent biography of the author Stephen Crane. What I do know about him is that he was briefly married to the brilliant writer Lydia Davis, and is now married to the author Siri Husfeldt, who, at least as I remember it, Fleur Pierets mentions in Julian as one of her favorite authors. Anyway, BAUMGARTNER is a quiet novel about a scholar and his memories of his dead wife, Anna, a lifetime of memories that swirl throughout this relatively short book. Not because the memories of her themselves are essential to the plot, but because recounting them allows us to understand the man. Although not an especially young woman, Anna died unexpectedly during a swimming accident. And Baumgarten is, as one description of the book says, trying to live in her absence. She was a poet, published but not incredibly widely, and Baumgartner's effort to build some kind of life without her partly entails allowing her poetry and her work as a poet to live again. One critic said that what Auster was exploring was the question of what a partnership might look like when one half is no longer there. That's very much what I felt about Fleur Pierets' book about her marriages to Julian, and it's really a beautiful line, I think, one that I feel like I'm living myself. Near the end of this book, we start to see how Baumgarten begins to embrace his memories of his wife in a more serious way, and yet also move forward into a new stage of life. There's quite a lot of ambiguity about what he's going to do in the future, and throughout, Auster writes in a way that allows us to see what flits through Baumgarten's mind, while at the same time not offering any judgment of him. For me, that choice works, but I can see why some readers might disagree. And then we get to the end, and all I will say is that it left me with a lot to think about. Okay, one more book. My favorite novel of the year so far, DAYSWORK, by the novelist Chris Bachelder and his spouse, the poet Jennifer Habel. I mentioned this book, although I hadn't read it yet at that point, early in January when I answered the university tag, as a book written by more than one author. After I filmed that video, I ran across an interview with the two writers talking about the actual logistics of how they produced the book. And instead of one person producing a first draft of a particular chapter and then passing it back and forth as they edited together, they literally sat together and talked through every line as they wrote it, fresh. I am fascinated and honestly almost baffled by how they could do that. I'll leave a link to that interview. I hadn't really thought about it before, but I guess all these books are about how marriage and writing are connected in the lives of the authors and characters. Well, let me go back to the plot of DAYSWORK for a moment. Although it's written by two authors, the story is told from the perspective of one person, a female narrator who talks a fair bit about her conversations with her husband. She is a serious reader, researching Moby Dick and the life of its author, Herman Melville. For those of you who are following Novella and Micah Cummins over at Classics and Company, as they lead us through Moby Dick right now, you might like to add this book to your shelf. Although DAYSWORK is a novel, the information about Melville is apparently completely based on fact, down to details about specific biographers who've written about Melville. That doesn't necessarily make it sound like this novel would be as emotionally rich as it is. First, the narrator and her family are living at the start of the pandemic. While it's clear she has a tradition of a perfectly nerdy relationship with her spouse, we see perhaps subtly that isolation has put even more emphasis on their intellectual companionship with each other. They don't have the kind of daily contact with colleagues that they might have had before, and they spend that time and thinking with each other. As the narrator shares what she's learning and the connection she's making with her husband, we realize that she has become a bit obsessed. Perhaps not quite as much as Ahab was, or that Melville was. And most interestingly, much of what she's learning is about both isolation and marriage. In addition to following Melville's connections with both his spouse and his friends, we hear a lot about biographers and fans of Melville, especially Elizabeth Hardwick, who wrote, among many other things, a short biography of Melville, and about her difficult relationship with her spouse, the poet Robert Lowell. There are moments when we see the parallels between Melville's marriage and Hardwick's marriage, and even moments where we see some potential resonance with certain parts of the narrator's marriage, too. I don't want to go into detail, but like Paul Auster's book, this is a book partly about memory and about the sense of connection that can happen with both reading and writing. It's a really quiet novel in some ways, and it's probably not right for everyone. But you don't need to know much at all about Moby Dick, and you don't even need to care about Melville's biography at all. This book uses that as a frame, as a way to explore something much broader. I was in tears, really good tears, at the gentleness and power of the ending, too. Okay, well, I think that will do it for this video. Thank you so much for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.